It was exactly midnight on December 29th when the Phoenix flag rose back over the Blue House. There was something almost eerie about the cold, calculated silence of the ritual. No cheering crowds, just this meticulously staged return to tradition. I was watching the broadcast in a quiet corner of a 24-hour soup house in Seoul, and the elderly owner, a man who had seen half a dozen presidents come and go, he didn't look happy. He looked relieved. He pointed at the screen with a trembling finger and just whispered, "The anchor is finally back in the water." To him, the past few years weren't just a political shift. They were a period of spatial dislocation, a time when power felt unmoored, ghostly, and dangerously personalized in the temporary offices of Yongsan. But his relief had this razor-sharp edge to it. When the news ticker scrolled past the indictment of 76 officials, the massive purge of the Leviathan, he didn't even flinch at the scale of the arrests. Instead, he told me a story about his grandson, who had spent 4 years in a windowless, go-see one room, studying like 18 hours a day for the civil service exam, only to find out that government seats were being sold behind closed doors like commodities in a shadow market. His eyes turned cold when the 15-year sentence for the brokers was mentioned. To him, this wasn't a scandal or a tragedy. It was a necessary immune response. And that's when it clicked for me. What we are witnessing in South Korea right now isn't just a change of administration or a standard corruption probe. It is the sound of a centuries-old bureaucratic Leviathan performing radical self-surgery without anesthesia. Why is this society so willing to embrace such brutal institutional violence? Why does it consistently choose a cold, rigid, and even imperial order over what they call a warm, chaotic mess? To understand why that flag is flying again, we have to look at the invisible meritocratic code that runs this nation and the terrifying efficiency with which the system purges its own blood to survive.
Wow. That story really just cuts to the heart of it, doesn't it?
It really does.
You have this deep sense of relief from the older generation, the idea that the anchor is back in the water, that the structure is stable again. But then it's immediately contrasted with this visceral rage from the younger generation whose entire future, their meritocratic path, was being sold off.
Exactly. And that's the core of this deep dive, isn't it? Understanding this unique national willingness to go through this kind of radical systemic purge.
It is. We're not just looking at a political scandal. We're looking at a form of institutional maintenance. And I think we need to dissect this through 3 key pillars that really explain this pattern of brutality and resilience.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the symbolic part of it, the return to a centralized authority, what you call the anchor. Then second, we have to look at the brutal mechanics of presidential accountability, which is often called the curse.
And it really is a curse.
It absolutely is. And finally, we have to evaluate the resilience of the developmental state itself, which we're calling the Leviathan self-surgery. Because this isn't random chaos. It's a calculated, almost self-aware process designed to make sure the institutional body survives, even if it means, cutting off its own head.
So let's start with that literal anchor. President Lee Jae-myung's decision in late 2025 to move the executive office and the residency back to the Blue House, or Cheong Wa Dae. This reverses the decision made just a few years earlier.
Right. The previous administration, under Yoon Suk-yeol, moved the office out of the Blue House, which is what created that feeling your soup house owner called spatial dislocation.
And that feeling was real.
It was palpable. Because for the first time since the Republic was founded, the seat of power was deliberately, unmoored. The Yoon administration moved out in May 2022. The idea was to signal a break from what they saw as the isolated imperial symbolism of the Blue House. They wanted a more open, accessible presidency.
But the new location, the Ministry of National Defense building in Yongsan, it just never clicked, did it? It never gained that symbolic legitimacy.
Not at all. So this recent return really reestablishes Cheong Wa Dae as the definitive, centralized seat of executive power.
I get the impulse to break with an imperial past, but why is the return to the Blue House now seen as a return to stability? I mean, wasn't the Blue Tile House itself seen as the problem?
Well, the problem with the Blue House wasn't really its history. It was more about how power became so concentrated and isolated there. But its symbolic weight is just immense. This site, you have to understand, is more than just an office building. It's a deeply historical anchor.
It goes back centuries.
Way back. It was the seat of political authority for the Yi dynasty. This wasn't some random piece of land they chose. It was the symbolic and strategic heart of power long before modern Korea even existed.
Which is why, when the Japanese appropriated that specific area during the colonial period, they weren't just building an office, they were sending a message.
They were sending a very clear message. They were trying to erase the historical legitimacy of Korean rule and declare that the old order was gone.
So after liberation, reclaiming that specific site was about more than just getting property back.
Exactly. It was about symbolically restoring the authentic Korean lineage of administrative continuity. So for older citizens, especially those who value that traditional Confucian bureaucratic authority, the Blue House embodies a long, rigid, and predictable order. And that rigidity isn't seen as a bad thing.
It's seen as stability.
It is stability. Yeah. So the return is a signal, especially to those stability-minded folks, that the government is rerouting itself in tradition and rejecting that unmoored, personalized power we saw for a few years.
It's a preference for an established domestic tradition over something new and, frankly, unstable.
And the controversy over the Yongsan move just made this return seem even more necessary.
Right, and this is where it gets really fascinating. The whole point of moving was to reject the imperial trappings, but the alternative they chose, Yongsan, seemed to carry an even worse symbolic burden.
The irony was just. It was stark. And the domestic criticism was brutal. Yongsan, the place they picked to escape a symbol of domestic imperialism, was historically the center of foreign military control.
For decades, it was right next to the massive U.S. Army base, a constant reminder of outside influence.
And even more critically, it was the main location for Imperial Japan's military barracks and headquarters from the late 19th century. So they were there even before the formal annexation in 1910.
So critics immediately saw the contradiction.
Of course, they're fleeing one symbol of inherited power only to land in a place that symbolizes foreign military imposition. One of the sharpest critiques even called it an act of sanctity, which basically means kowtowing to a greater power. It was seen as a betrayal of national sovereignty.
So the debate was never really about office space, it was about national identity.
Absolutely. It was a conflict over symbolism, history, and autonomy. So choosing the Blue House, again, despite its flaws, is a clear choice for a domestic historical tradition, however rigid, over a space that's just stained by foreign control. The flag going back up is the system asserting its own authority. It's the end of that spatial dislocation.
The anchor might be back, but historically, that anchor seems to be chained to a curse. And that brings us to the second pillar, this incredible pattern of prosecuting the elite. Jailing former leaders has become, almost a predictable feature of Korean democracy since 1987.
It's astonishing, really. What sets South Korea apart is just the relentless scale of it. Think about it. For 234 years in the U.S., prosecuting a former president was basically unthinkable.
Right, even Watergate ended in a pardon.
Exactly. It was seen as too destabilizing. But in Korea, the political system seems not only willing to tolerate this instability, but almost to perform it, to embrace it.
And the scorecard is just brutal. 4 former presidents, Chun Doo-won, Roh Tae-woo, Lee Myung-bak, Park Geun-hye, served prison time for massive crimes. Treason, bribery, you name it.
And the cycle just keeps going. Roh Moo-hyun took his own life during an investigation. And most recently, Yoon Suk-yeol was indicted for leading an insurrection in 2024.
It almost makes you think the top job in Korea is more of a liability than an honor. You know your next step is probably going to be an indictment.
And that cynicism is very real. But you can look at this in two ways. On the one hand, you could say it's a sign of incredible institutional strength. It shows that no one, not even the most powerful person in the country, is above the law.
But on the other hand,
it highlights just how pervasive corruption is. And it's been normalized by that cynical attitude of, well, if you dig deep enough, you'll always find something.
So if this isn't just a string of, unlucky presidents, what are the actual structural patterns that keep this cycle going?
Well, the research points to 4 distinct interlocking patterns. The first, and maybe the most obvious one, is just straight-up political retribution.
Political payback.
Exactly. Prosecuting your rival has become an expected, almost defining achievement for a new administration during its short 5-year term. The prosecution service is technically independent, but the president appoints the prosecutor general, which creates, subtle but powerful ways to influence investigations.
We saw Moon Jae-in go after Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, and before that, it was others. It weaponizes the justice system.
It makes it an existential risk for any former leader. And that leads to the second pattern, which really explains the deep financial corruption, the state-chaebol symbiosis.
This goes back to the developmental state model, right? That centralized economic engine that Park Chung-hee set up.
Yes, and this is a really critical mechanism to understand. The government didn't just regulate the market, it actively steered it. This created these incredibly intense, intimate ties between the public sector and the big private conglomerates, the chaebols like Samsung, Hyundai, PO. They became national partners.
And how did that symbiosis actually work? What did the state provide?
Basically, the state gave them 3 crucial guarantees that took a lot of the risk out of doing business in these huge long-term industries. First, guaranteed credit. The state controlled the banks and funneled cheap loans to chaebols in strategic sectors.
So they always had capital.
Always. Second, single window licensing. Government officials would just fast-track all the permits and regulatory approvals, cutting through red tape. And third, protection from foreign competition. High tariff and other barriers meant these domestic champions could grow without having to worry about immediate foreign pressure.
So the state de-risked their ventures and gave them a ton of capital, and in return, the chaebols.
In return, they aligned their business with national policy goals. They focused on exports, created jobs, and invested where the government told them to. And at first, this was growth-enhancing. It was a coordinated national effort. But inevitably, that intimacy just devolved into a system of payments.
Bribes.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
It became easier and cheaper for corporate leaders to make illicit payments for favorable policies or relaxed oversight or even personal favors for the president.
Which is exactly what we saw with Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak, who were both tied to massive bribery schemes with Samsung. The system itself just creates the opportunity for corruption at the very top.
And that brings us to the third pattern, presidential family corruption. Because of these intimate ties and a lack of clear boundaries, the president's family members often leverage those connections for their own personal gain.
And even if the president isn't directly involved, they always take the fall.
Always. It happened with Kim Dae-jung's sons, who were convicted of taking bribes. More recently, there were allegations involving President Moon Jae-in's son-in-law. It's this consistent structural weakness, the failure to build a wall between the office and the family, that the justice system is just designed to exploit once a president leaves power.
And the final pattern is almost the most cynical of all, the political pardon tool.
This is the release valve that just completely undermines the whole process. It neuters the rule of law. When a president like Moon pardons his predecessor, Park Geun-hye, to unify the nation, or when Yoon Duk-hoon pardons Lee Myung-bak to shore up his conservative base,
it's just a transparently political calculation.
It is. It basically says, yes, we'll prosecute you, but don't worry, the jail time isn't permanent. It kills the deterrent effect of punishment and just reinforces this whole cycle.
And this is where my story about the grandson and the purge of the Leviathan comes back in. The indictment of those 76 officials isn't seen as a tragedy. It's seen as a necessary immune response because it's meant to restore the sanctity of that meritocratic code.
Precisely. And we should pause here and really define what that code costs. You mentioned the grandson studying in a Go-C1. For anyone listening who doesn't know, a Go-C1 is a tiny, often windowless microroom where students lock themselves away for years to study for these hyper-competitive civil service exams.
They're sacrificing everything, their youth, their health, their money.
Everything. All on the promise that if they study 18 hours a day, the system will reward their merit with a stable, respected government job. The civil service exam is seen as the ultimate equalizer. So when news comes out that those seats were just being sold, it's a fundamental violation of the state's legitimacy. The demand for the purge is the collective voice of those people saying, you have to tear out the corruption to restore the system's promise.
So that demand for this ruthless self-correction brings us to our third pillar. Why does the Korean system have this incredible resilience? We're calling it the developmental state's self-surgery. Why does this society accept such radical violence against its own elite?
The willingness to go through that pain, I think, is really rooted in the success of the East Asian developmental state model. I mean, South Korea's phenomenal post-war economic growth, the miracle on the Han River, that wasn't a free market accident. It was orchestrated by a high-capacity government that actively steered the market, mostly through the chaebols.
It was a very focused, production-first model. It had a directional thrust.
That's the key. The state's strategy required harsh, centralized control. It forced people to curb consumption to maximize national investment. It promoted exports. It made sure precious foreign exchange was spent on importing capital and machinery, not consumer goods. It was highly effective, often repressive, and it depended on the state having the power to discipline the very capitalists it was creating.
And like we said, that symbiosis created corruption, but in the early days, that was almost tolerated because it was seen as, greasing the wheels for rapid growth.
But eventually, the system generated massive instability and mistrust. You see it in the recurring crises. The 1997 financial meltdown, the 2016 impeachment of Park, the 2024 martial law attempt. These aren't just bumps in the road. These are what the sociologist Nicholas Luhmann called legitimacy-threatening effects, moments where the whole system is about to break down.
Okay, so let's unpack that term you used earlier, autopoiesis, or structural self-correction. It sounds academic, but it really explains this brutal reality.
Autopoiesis just describes systems that are self-replicating and self-referential. So think of the developmental state as a huge organism, the Leviathan. When it faces a severe crisis, it's forced to reorganize and adapt to survive. It's a high-stakes evolutionary process.
So if corruption is the disease, the purge is literally the surgery.
That's the perfect analogy. The system is eating its own diseased tissue to make sure the healthy core survives. The political instability, the prosecution cycles, they act as a constant catalyst for democratic consolidation. The system is so finely tuned to this idea of functional efficiency and meritocracy that when its legitimacy is threatened, it violently removes the failures.
And the successful impeachment of a sitting president like Park Geun-hye, and then the complete failure of Yoon's martial law attempt, that shows the system's ability to self-correct.
Designed to reject profound failure. So the radical institutional violence, the arrests, the prison sentences, the purge of 76 officials, this is the performative measure the system uses to prove it's still legitimate. It's the liquidation of non-compliant elites.
It's the system preserving itself by getting rid of the corrupt elements to ensure long-term stability.
Exactly. The cost of institutional failure is just considered too high, so the system prefers the short-term pain of this brutal self-surgery.
And this belief in high-capacity government has to be rooted in real-world examples of it actually working. Let's talk about the heavy and chemical industries, or HCI, drive as the proof of concept that reinforces this whole societal preference.
The HCI drive from 1973 to 79 is the classic case study. And it wasn't driven by some abstract economic theory. It was prompted by a national security crisis after the U.S. started withdrawing troops from the region. The state decided it needed to create strategic industries for national survival military equipment, steel, petrochemicals, everything needed for a modern economy.
So they were trying to transform a light industrial economy into a heavy industrial one, basically doing in a few years what took Japan decades.
And the results were just undeniable. They established the fundamental contract between the state and the people.
Yeah.
High-capacity government delivers prosperity and security. The data shows that during and after the HCI drive, the targeted industries, steel, shipbuilding, basic electronics, grew significantly faster in both output and productivity than the non-targeted industries.
And the really critical finding isn't just that they grew faster back then, but that those effects lasted.
Yes. The differences in productivity and growth persisted for years after the policy officially ended. And maybe more importantly, the positive spillover effects were massive. The state engineered lower input prices for things like steel and petrochemicals, which then meant cheaper manufacturing costs for all the downstream sectors. It made Korean exports incredibly competitive on the global stage.
So that history confirms that effective, steered governance, no matter how rigid, gets results that are tied directly to national survival and prosperity. And that historical success is what makes institutional failure like selling off civil service seats not just a problem, but an existential threat that has to be violently cut out to preserve the Leviathan's core legitimacy.
The pain of the purge, when you look at it that way, is the price you pay for institutional survival. The society chooses to endure this brutality because it values the perceived fairness and the proven capacity of a meritocratic, rigid state.
Which brings us to the foot soldiers of this institutional purge, the citizens themselves, who is actually demanding this radical self-surgery. We know instability is a key factor. It can lead to democratic backsliding, or it can lead to consolidation.
And in the Korean context, the evidence overwhelmingly points to consolidation.
Yeah.
Periods of high political instability, like a massive corruption scandal or martial law attempt, they significantly amplify the public's demand for institutional reforms. When the system is visibly breaking, the demand for accountability just spikes.
We're talking about the preference for reform nearly doubling, right? From about 35% in stable times to 68% during a crisis. That tells you that citizens see a crisis not as a time to despair, but as an opportunity for a necessary, even brutal house cleaning.
Absolutely. The decision to embrace this brutal institutional violence is really rooted in specific, highly invested parts of society that see these crises as the moment for adaptation. We can even break down who these reformers are demographically.
Okay, let's start with age and income. They seem to be really closely linked to the demand for change.
There's a very clear generational divide. Younger people, say 18 to 35, along with those in higher income brackets, are statistically much more likely to see a crisis as an opportunity for reform. Older individuals, who live through the stability of the developmental state, tend to favor the status quo above all else.
And this goes right back to the soup house owner's grandson. He represents that young, meritocratically invested segment. They're not just angry about corruption, they are demanding a purge to restore the promise of the system because that promise is their only perceived path to a stable future.
And that youth demographic, 18 to 29, they show intense concern over unemployment and social welfare. They're the most vulnerable to economic shocks, and they're in one of the most competitive job markets on the planet. So when the system fails them by allowing seats to be sold, the purge that follows is seen as a validation of their years of sacrifice in the Gosi 1. It restores the contract.
And the economic pressure on them is just immense. The cost of housing in cities, the precarious employment, instability hits them the hardest. The purge is seen as a way to curb the excesses of the elite that cause that instability.
We also see some really interesting differences based on gender. Men are statistically more likely to prioritize issues around economic stability and political development. For example, unemployment and political development are top priorities for men during a crisis. This means men are about 44% more likely to be proactive in demanding institutional reform.
So they're more focused on the structural, functional parts of the state's economic engine. What about women's priorities?
Women tend to place a greater emphasis on welfare, social health care, regional issues, and housing stability. It reflects a prioritization of social equity, community well-being, and support systems for vulnerable people during times of crisis. So while both groups demand accountability, men focus more on the efficiency and security of the developmental state model, while women focus more on its social safety net. A successful systemic response has to address both.
And education. The very thing the grandson is fighting for is also clearly linked to a demand for the system to consolidate itself.
It is. Higher education correlates very strongly with a preference for political development and systemic resilience. People with graduate degrees are much more focused on political development and regional issues because they're often more aware of the structural challenges that crises make worse. They advocate for systemic solutions, not just quick fixes.
It paints a picture of a brutally self-critical citizenry. But when the dust settles, where does their trust actually lie? I mean, they're constantly jailing their political leaders, so it can't be in the political parties.
And that is a crucial distinction. Citizens show overwhelmingly high trust and awareness in civil society, much, much higher than their trust in government institutions. Trust in civil society is over 91%.
That's a massive mandate for non-governmental action and a huge indictment of the political establishment.
The political parties are widely seen as weak. They're criticized for prioritizing parochial interests, regionalism, a lack of ideological diversity. So because the formal political structure is seen as failing, profound change often just bypasses the parties completely. It emerges through popular, spontaneous movements.
Like the massive candlelight protests in 2016 that brought down Park Geun-hye.
Exactly. The citizenry, acting through civil society, becomes the true guardian of the meritocratic code and the system's integrity. They are the ones who demand the purge when the Leviathan falters. And it's this civic vibrancy combined with the institution's adaptability that has consistently prevented these crises from leading to genuine democratic backsliding. The people make sure the self-surgery happens.
Which makes the system's resilience even more remarkable. It's this perpetual high-stakes negotiation between a highly centralized, historically effective state and a demanding, mobilized, and hypercritical public.
So, to synthesize all this, the recurring institutional violence, the presidential curse, the purge of the Leviathan. This is South Korea's unique and, yes, painful method of institutional self-preservation. It's a calculated choice to endure short-term pain to prevent a catastrophic long-term failure.
It's a strategy that's rooted in their history. The system consistently chooses a cold, rigid order because that order has proven it can deliver high-capacity governance and national stability. And this choice is made by a society that is deeply, deeply invested in the promise of meritocracy. The pain of the purge is just seen as the necessary cost to maintain fairness and ensure that the grandson in the Gosi 1 still believes the system actually works.
The flag flying over the Blue House again, right after the indictment of 76 officials, is the system's declaration. The anchor is back. The bureaucratic Leviathan is still functional, the painful self-surgery has been done, and democratic norms, ironically, have actually been reinforced through all this turmoil.
We've looked very closely at this process of transformation, moving from what you could call the historical developmental state 1.0 to a rapidly evolving 2.0. That old model thrived on targeted subsidies and protectionism. But today, South Korea is fully integrated into a hyper-globalized world, dominated by complex value chains, financialization, and IP monopolies forces often steered by Western economic ideas.
And the fact that South Korea, now a highly developed nation, not only retains but actively enforces these radical internal purges and self-correction measures, it suggests a profound institutional belief. In a global economy where external shocks like the US dollar cycle or geopolitical supply chain disruptions can wreck a nation's GDP and stability, the need for that directional thrust might be reasserting itself. To survive modern financialized globalization, highly integrated nations might feel they have to retain a hidden capacity for centralized steering and ruthless internal cleansing. Otherwise, they risk becoming subject to forces entirely beyond their own national development project. The self-surgery is how they keep control of their own destiny.